In this video, we're introducing an app which may be the most accurate tool to detect exercise intensity outside of a lab. It's called VTCheck, and it uses cutting-edge statistical analysis to measure your metabolic stability via your breath and heart rate. Now, most athletes control intensity by keeping their workouts within certain zones, delineated by heart rate or lactate thresholds. However, this sort of analysis can be misleading because an athlete's true thresholds can change on a daily basis. So the current state-of-the-art that physiologists use to determine intensity is something called respiratory kinetics, which analyzes how much your breathing drifts during exercise. This is the most accurate way to classify intensity because respiration directly tracks what's happening inside the muscle during exercise and follows certain consistent patterns depending on the zone. In zones 1 and 2, also known as the moderate domain, initially there's a ramp-up period where the body utilizes fast-acting anaerobic sources to supply energy as blood begins to circulate and muscle fibers are recruited. Then, after the aerobic system has warmed up, there's a prolonged steady state, which signals that your body is in homeostasis, where metabolic byproducts are cleared out via your breath just as fast as they're produced. In zones 3 and 4, also known as the heavy domain, there's a similar ramp-up period, but instead of your heart rate and breathing immediately reaching a steady state, they continue to drift, at least for 10 to 20 minutes, because at higher intensities, your body recruits more fast-twitch fibers, which produce more byproducts, so your body has to work harder to maintain stability. And finally, in zone 5, also known as the severe domain, after the ramp-up period, both your heart rate and breathing continue to rise indefinitely, often exponentially, as your body's unable to achieve stability. Historically, this sort of analysis could only be performed in a lab, but then, in the fall of last year, a company called Timeware released the VitalPro strap, which accurately measures ventilation in real time. However, after purchasing the VitalPro myself, I soon discovered that breathing data has a lot of noise, making it very difficult for the naked eye to assess. And so I created VTCheck to utilize the statistical models from these studies to classify workout intensity from your ventilation if you own a VitalPro, or from your heart rate if you just own a heart rate monitor. I'll explain how it works with a few examples. So here's a scatter plot of each of my breaths recorded during a run. If you don't own a VitalPro, you'll get a similar view with your heart rate data. The first step of the analysis involves applying an outlier filter to clean up aberrant data points. Then we fit something called a mono-exponential curve to this filtered data. There's a lot of complexity to this protocol that I won't get into in this video, but basically this function analyzes your data and solves for what your breathing or heart rate should look like if you're in perfect steady-state homeostasis. So in this case, my projected steady-state ventilation is around 69 liters per minute and my steady-state heart rate is 113 beats per minute. But as you can see, my data spikes up and down around the steady state line continuously throughout the run. So how do we make sense of it? We apply regression, drawing a line after the end of my ramp-up period through the middle of my data to estimate the drift of my breathing or heart rate relative to the steady state baseline. When we compare the slope of this green line to the purple steady state curve, it tells us how much my data is drifting. So in this case, both my ventilation and heart rate drifts were relatively low, below the allowable drift for the moderate domain. However, because ventilatory data is noisy and heart rate data can be significantly impacted by environmental factors, we don't rely on regression alone for purposes of intensity classification. We employ a secondary statistical tool called CUSUM, or CUSUM for short, to validate the results. CUSUM is primarily used in the healthcare and manufacturing industries to detect subtle but meaningful shifts in erratic data. And it's also been applied to ventilation and exercise studies as well, which makes it suited for this particular purpose. In very simple terms, the way CUSUM works is by keeping a running tally of each data point's deviations from a specified control, in this case the allowable drift, and then it triggers an alarm when the cumulative sum of those deviations reaches a level of statistical significance. So in this case, you can see that although the CUSUM value accumulates at various points during the run where the data spikes, the line remains green. Accordingly, in this case, both the regression and CUSUM analyses are in agreement, and this run is classified as moderate. But what happens when the regression and CUSUM analyses disagree? Well, for VitalPro users, there's a third test which we'll show using another example, this time a 4x6 threshold session. So as you can see, in the first 3 intervals, my breathing was kept in control with no drift. However, the 4th interval paints a very different picture as I became more fatigued. Here we see that the slope line has turned red, meaning that it's detected a drift above the VT2 cap. And we also see the CUSUM values progressively accumulate to a much greater extent compared to the other intervals, but it remains yellow, meaning it did not detect a statistically significant amount of residuals above my VT2 cap. So here, the slope test is saying that I'm above VT2, and CUSUM is saying I'm below VT2. How do we break the tie? With the recovery score. You see, in addition to there being a plethora of studies on respiratory kinetics during a workout, there's also been a lot of research on respiratory kinetics during recoveries, sometimes referred to as the off-transient period. And similar to workout respiration, recovery breathing tends to follow a distinct pattern based on the intensity of the workout that preceded it as a function of the amount of oxygen debt incurred. In essence, the recovery score calculates how far your breathing drops during the first 60 seconds of rest compared to your baseline breathing rate, which is taken prior to the session. So in this case, after this last interval, I recovered 58% of my baseline breathing, which is above the 50% recovery threshold that you would expect to see if I was in the severe domain. Now obviously not everyone will have the same recovery rate. For example, well-trained endurance athletes should be able to recover their breathing much more efficiently compared to less trained individuals. Given this, VTCheck uses a machine learning algorithm to adjust your recovery thresholds as well as a few other metrics, including your aerobic and anaerobic thresholds. Previously, I used to perform a ramp test at least once every 4 weeks so that I would have accurate zones to use for my workouts. However, since VTCheck updates my thresholds for my regular runs, the last ramp test I performed was back in November, and I don't intend to do any testing in the future for a number of reasons. First of all, ramp tests require that you go to failure, which places quite a bit of strain on the body and can disrupt your programming. Secondly, it's unclear how accurate the ramp test results actually are. Unlike lactate, which shows clear exponential changes as your work rate increases, ventilation tends to increase linearly, making it hard to identify specific breakpoints. In fact, every ramp test I've done has produced different results, which I don't think was entirely because of a change in fitness. Also, because of the inherent noise in ventilation data, choosing one specific ventilation value from a ramp test as your threshold seems to be somewhat arbitrary. For example, from my November ramp test, my VT2 pace was 8 miles per hour with a VE of 120. However, if we look at my ventilation data from the test during the 8 mile per hour stage, the values range from 63 to 197, which is quite a large gap. So instead of pinning my thresholds to specific values derived from 2-minute stages of a ramp test, now I just allow VTCheck to calibrate my thresholds for my regular runs, which provides for a lot more data and continuously updates as my fitness changes. So for example, here's a 20-minute threshold run that I performed more recently. Notice that the average VE value is 147, yet my ventilation was stable, which shouldn't be the case if I was actually in the severe domain. If I simply relied on my old ramp test values to control intensity, this run would have been way over my threshold. But in reality it was not, because it's physically impossible to have a flat ventilatory curve for 20 minutes above VT2. Now you may be wondering what VTCheck does with these VT1 and VT2 thresholds since the drift analysis we've been discussing doesn't use them. Well, since the drift analysis can only be performed accurately post hoc, VTCheck utilizes your specific thresholds calibrated from your run history to determine your intensity in real time during each workout. I'll show how this works from a run I recorded with the VTCheck phone app. When the run begins, you'll get a visualization of each of your breaths, represented by these faint dots, as well as a regression line that shows the overall trend of your ventilation. To monitor your stability, the app also shows your slope, which indicates how much your ventilation is changing second by second, and your drift, which indicates how much your ventilation has changed since the end of the ramp-up period. You could think of the drift as a sort of lightweight version of the drift analysis on the website that we just discussed. And this chart will change colors based on which zone you're in. The app determines this by applying CUSUM, but in the zone analysis, instead of detecting deviations from expected drift, CUSUM detects deviations from your calibrated thresholds. So in this run, the chart starts out green, indicating that I'm in the moderate domain. When my ventilation spikes above my aerobic threshold, those positive deviations start to accumulate. The chart will only change color, signifying that I've entered into the heavy domain when I've accumulated ventilation values above the aerobic threshold that significantly outweigh my ventilation values below the threshold. And the same logic applies in the heavy domain. When I'm breathing above my anaerobic threshold, CUSUM begins to accumulate. Breaths below the threshold decrease that accumulation. And once I've accumulated a significant amount of ventilation values above the anaerobic threshold, the color changes to red, indicating I'm in the severe domain. So in real time, instead of having a hair trigger that tells you that you've changed zones based on single erratic breaths, CUSUM applies a statistical significance test to help confirm that the change is real. Now, there's a lot more detail about VTCheck that I could get into, but I'll stop here for now. VTCheck is currently in beta, and it's free to try by going to VTCheck.com. So if you own a Vital Pro strap or a heart rate monitor, feel free to check it out, and I'd love to hear your feedback.